There's a biological cost to distraction. Every time you shift your attention away from your own path to compare, argue, or explain yourself to others, you're not just wasting time. You're weakening your focus circuitry, neuronal systems in your brain that, when trained properly, increase your clarity, your energy, and your ability to follow through. So here's the truth: focus is not just a mindset. It's a skill that is rooted in your nervous system. It can be trained, but only in silence, only in solitude, only in the absence of noise. There is tremendous power in working on yourself quietly. Let's break this down, starting with how your brain handles attention. Your prefrontal cortex, the area right behind your forehead, is responsible for focus, planning, and long-term thinking. But it doesn't work alone. It communicates with a deeper structure called the basal ganglia. This system acts like a pattern recognition and habit formation loop. When you focus on something repeatedly, even in silence, you strengthen those neural connections. Over time, what was once difficult becomes automatic. This is how you build a high-performing identity, by repeatedly focusing inward and not wasting cognitive resources outward. That's why staying silent is not weakness. It's discipline. It's nervous system optimization. Because here's the issue: when you're constantly reacting to others, scrolling through validation, defending your journey, or arguing for your decisions, your brain is burning glucose and dopamine on things that don't move your life forward. You're exhausting your executive function, your ability to make sharp, calculated decisions. You dilute your neurochemical focus. You fracture your momentum. And over time, the brain learns that others are more important than your own path. That is neuroplasticity in the wrong direction. But when you deliberately withdraw your attention from the external and place it back into your own internal goals, your fitness, your skills, your routines, you begin rewiring the brain to prioritize what actually matters. You build what's called internal locus of control. This is a term in behavioral science that refers to the belief that you are in control of your life, not the opinions, approval, or actions of others. People with a high internal locus of control outperform everyone else. They are more focused, more resilient under stress, and less prone to depression and anxiety. Why? Because their neurochemistry is not anchored to external chaos. They are grounded internally. You become that when you learn to stay silent and work. Now let's talk physiology. When you engage in deep internal work, whether that's lifting, studying, or training, you activate your sympathetic nervous system, the system responsible for drive and alertness. But when you are constantly explaining yourself, engaging with critics, or trying to be seen, you're placing yourself in a reactive loop. This leads to a spike in cortisol, a stress hormone that, when chronic, kills progress. That tension you feel when people misunderstand you, when they gossip about you, or when they judge you, let it sit, let it pass. Why? Because choosing not to react builds what's known as psychological resilience. Every time you withhold the impulse to respond, you strengthen your frontal cortex and weaken the reactive limbic loop. Over time, your threshold for stress increases. You stop being easily triggered. You stop chasing people's understanding. You start moving in silence. And that silence is sacred. In neuroscience, there's a principle called Hebbian learning. Neurons that fire together wire together. So if you're constantly firing circuits of comparison, gossip, or seeking validation, you're wiring your brain to need those things. But if you repeatedly focus inward, even silently, and place your attention on your own daily actions, your own micro goals, your own process, you were your brain for autonomy, consistency, and calm execution. People often mistake silence for passivity. That's incorrect. In reality, silence is a training tool. It's a neurobiological resource. It preserves dopamine for real work, not fake validation. Every word you don't speak, every opinion you don't give, every argument you don't start, that's power conserved. That's focus redirected. That's energy stored for your own evolution. And yes, it's going to be lonely. That's part of the process. Because the brain doesn't like uncertainty. It craves feedback. So when you go silent, the uncertainty can feel overwhelming. But here's the trick: your brain adapts. After about 21 days of silence-driven focus, your nervous system adjusts. You become calmer. You stop craving attention. You stop needing noise. And from that stillness, something emerges: clarity. You start seeing what matters. Your goals come into focus. Your path becomes obvious. The distractions no longer pull at you because your reward system, your dopamine system, is realigned. It no longer fires for likes or attention. It fires for completion, mastery, and personal growth. So how do you do this? You schedule focus. You create blocks of time daily, 60 to 90 minutes, where you eliminate all external input. No messages, no social, no distractions, just you and the work. That's how you train your attention system. That's how you grow. Next, you embrace stillness. Don't explain yourself. Don't announce your goals. Don't seek validation for your process. Let people talk. Let them guess. Your brain isn't here to explain. It's here to evolve. And finally, you protect your energy like your life depends on it. Because it does. The version of you that is disciplined, focused, and purpose-driven. That version only comes alive in silence. There's a quote in neuroscience that says, "The brain is a prediction machine." If you want your brain to predict success, feed it signals of mastery. Feed it effort. Feed it silence. Stay quiet. Stay consistent. Let your results make the noise. Because in the end, the deepest confidence doesn't come from proving people wrong. It comes from knowing without a word that you stayed the course. And that is how you win. Silence is not the absence of communication. It's the conservation of power. Every time you speak, engage, defend, argue, or try to be understood, you are making a neurological transaction. You're spending limited resources, glucose, dopamine, acetylcholine, cortisol, just to maintain a presence in noise. And when these resources are spent on survival communication instead of strategic transformation, your neural circuit changing, you're left mentally dysregulated and biologically unprepared for real growth. What most people don't realize is that silence doesn't just create space. It creates energy. It builds reserves within your nervous system that allow you to think more clearly, act more decisively, and endure stress more effectively. Inside your brain, there's a complex network of systems working in tandem to keep you alert and focused. Among them, your dopaminergic system governs motivation and goal-seeking behavior. But dopamine is not infinite. It is produced in bursts, and those bursts are highly sensitive to reward cues. The more you seek reward through speaking, through being seen, acknowledged, or validated, the more your dopamine system shifts its baseline. Eventually, you need more stimulus to get the same level of satisfaction. This is how you burn out your drive. This is how you become addicted to attention and drained by your own progress. Silence recalibrates your dopamine system. When you stop reacting, stop sharing every move, and stop giving energy to noise, allow your neurochemistry to reset. You rebuild that healthy reward response that comes not from being seen, but from doing the work. Now consider the energy cost of attention switching. Every time you pivot your focus, from your own goals to someone's opinion, from your process to someone else's success, you are engaging what's called task switching in the prefrontal cortex. This is one of the most metabolically expensive processes in the brain. It consumes glucose at a rapid rate and depletes your cognitive bandwidth. That mental fog you feel after scrolling, arguing, or explaining, that's your brain telling you you're spending energy on the wrong things. Silence protects you from this. When you don't switch. When you don't explain, you stay in your lane. That means your glucose is preserved for problem solving, creativity, and execution, the functions that build your future. It goes deeper than mental energy. Your silence also regulates your autonomic nervous system. When you engage in conflict or emotional conversations, your sympathetic nervous system is activated. Heart rate increases, blood pressure rises, cortisol floods your system. This is useful in life or death situations. But when triggered repeatedly in daily life through constant verbal engagement, this stress response becomes chronic. Chronic sympathetic activation leads to fatigue, anxiety, inflammation, and cognitive decline. Silence acts as a brake pedal. It activates the parasympathetic nervous system responsible for rest, recovery, and regeneration. It slows the heart, lowers cortisol, and restores your body to balance. That is not just peace, it's power. Power to recover, to recharge, and to build resilience from the inside out. Let's also talk about the power of internal speech. Your brain processes internal and external dialogue differently. When you speak outwardly, especially in high-emotion contexts, you are reinforcing mental loops and beliefs at the neural level. This is called Hebbian learning, neurons that fire together wired together. So every time you say, "they don't understand me," or "I need to defend myself," you're not just expressing a thought, you're reinforcing a circuit. Over time, your brain starts defaulting to these circuits even when silence would serve you better. But when you withhold speech and observe thought without reacting, you interrupt that loop. You create cognitive distance between your emotions and your actions. That gap, created through silence, is the birthplace of self-mastery. You stop being ruled by reactive emotions and start directing your energy with precision. There is also a concept in neuroscience called mental time travel. It refers to your brain's ability to imagine past and future scenarios. This ability is strongest during quiet, nonverbal states. When you're silent, truly silent, you engage the default mode network. This network is responsible for insight, long-term vision, creative problem solving, and planning. But it only activates when you are not engaging externally. That's why your best ideas don't come during debates or meetings. They come in the shower, during a walk, or while journaling. Silence gives you access to the highest form of cognition. It's not absence, it's elevation. Most people never realize this because they're stuck in cycles of verbal output. They feel the urge to respond, to justify, to narrate their progress. But in doing so, they miss the deeper work that happens beneath the noise. They spend their energy being visible, not valuable. They drain their neurochemical reserves on projection, not preparation. And that depletion shows up in every area of life, in their emotional instability, their inconsistent performance, their inability to sustain effort without external motivation. But if you choose silence, you choose to redirect that energy. Every word not spoken becomes fuel for mental clarity. Every explanation withheld becomes strength and restraint. Every conversation you walk away from becomes another drop of stored focus. Over time, you accumulate energy, your baseline dopamine increases, your cortisol decreases, your nervous system recalibrates to a higher level of calm performance. That's when you become unstoppable. Not because you're louder than others, but because you're more neurologically efficient. Silence also reinforces identity. There is a psychological phenomenon called the looking glass self. It's the idea that we form our self-concept based on how others respond to us. If you're constantly putting yourself out there and adjusting to feedback, you risk building an identity that is reactive, not authentic. But when you move in silence, you reduce external feedback. This forces your identity to be built from within. You start acting from internal alignment, not social calibration. And that kind of selfhood is powerful. It's unshakable because it's not built on likes, comments, or validation. It's built on neurobiological certainty. Now let's bring it into the practical. Silence is a practice. It's a neurological protocol. You create deliberate time in your day where you choose not to speak, not to respond and not to consume noise. It could be 30 minutes of stillness in the morning. It could be an hour focused, isolated work. It could be one full day each week where you speak only when necessary. During this time, you let your brain rest from reactivity. You allow your body to drop out of fight or flight. You stop scattering your attention. And instead, you let the deep systems of your mind engage in real transformation. This isn't about being passive. It's about being powerful in a different way. A smarter way. A biologically aligned way. Because the people who are loudest are not always the strongest. And the people who are most seen are not always the most stable. But the person who can conserve energy, direct attention, and move with quiet discipline, that person is dangerous. Not because they make noise, because they don't need to. They are not distracted by applause. They are not weakened by opinions. They are not pulled off course by criticism. They are neurologically anchored in their mission. And that anchoring comes from silence. So if you want real energy, real clarity, and real control, stop spending your voice where it isn't necessary. Stop paying attention to things that don't feed your evolution. Stop burning neurochemical fuel on reactions that lead nowhere. Focus. Conserve. Direct. Let the silence build you. Let it sharpen your edges, center your nervous system, and prepare your mind for higher levels of performance. Because when your biology is aligned with your mission, your silence becomes your strongest form of momentum. Silence isn't just the absence of sound, it's a neurological decision, one that shapes the trajectory of your focus, your energy, and your identity. When you choose silence over reaction, you're not retreating from life, you're engaging with it at a more intelligent level. You're choosing to preserve your neurochemical energy, the fuel that drives your clarity, attention, motivation, and performance. Every time you speak without necessity, argue without purpose, or explain yourself in an attempt to be understood, you're trading your biological strength for temporary validation. You're paying in dopamine and glucose, in acetylcholine, the very chemicals your brain needs to function at its highest level. And the more often you make that trade, the more depleted you become, not just mentally but biologically. Silence is not passive. Silence is strategic. It's how the brain resets and rebuilds. In the human brain, energy is not unlimited. Every thought, every spoken word, every reaction comes at a cost. Glucose is the primary energy source for the brain, and it is finite. When you engage in emotionally charged dialogue, when you defend your opinions or involve yourself in trivial debates, you're using up that precious energy. What most people don't realize is that attention is one of the most energy-expensive processes the brain engages in, especially attention that is fractured, reactive, and constantly shifting from internal goals to external distractions. When you choose silence, you're not just avoiding conflict. You're reclaiming that energy. You're rerouting it back into systems that drive long-term achievement, deep work, clarity, emotional regulation, and creativity. That's the hidden currency of silence. It pays you back in endurance, in presence, and in consistency. Neurochemically, your body responds to speech and reactivity the way it responds to stress. The sympathetic nervous system, designed for fight or flight, gets activated not just by danger, but by emotional engagement. You argue with someone, your heart rate increases. You get criticized, and cortisol floods your bloodstream. You feel misunderstood, and the limbic system flares up, pulling energy away from your frontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for rational thinking and decision-making. The more you engage in this kind of energy-burning activity, the more reactive you become. Your baseline stress levels rise. You become more impulsive, less clear-headed, and more dependent on external stimulation to feel alive. But when you choose silence, something profound happens. Your body exits that reactive state. Your parasympathetic nervous system activates, promoting calm, repair, and focus. Your cortisol levels drop. Your brain begins to relocate energy to the higher centers. The prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate, the insula, areas that help you regulate emotion, stay focused, and act with intention. This is what builds resilience, not noise. Not quite alignment. Dopamine, the molecule of motivation, is another critical factor in this equation. Dopamine doesn't just get released when you achieve something, it gets released in anticipation of a reward. But the more you chase immediate verbal validation, likes, reactions, responses, the more your brain shifts its reward threshold. It starts to expect quick hits of dopamine. And when you don't get them, motivation drops. That's when fatigue sets in. That's when you start needing more stimulation, more attention just to feel okay. This is how chronic verbal engagement leads to burnout. You're not just tired, you're neurochemically empty. Silence interrupts that loop. When you stop sharing every thought, every move, every reaction, you allow the dopamine system to reset. You allow it to recalibrate its baseline so that motivation comes not from being seen, but from the act of building. That's a deeper form of drive, a purer form of power. Your neural circuitry is the role of acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter of focus. Acetylcholine works like a spotlight in the brain. It tells your neurons, this is important. Pay attention here. But it can only do its job when your attention is stable. When you're constantly distracted by chatter, by opinions, by unnecessary conversations, that spotlight becomes scattered. You lose the ability to focus deeply. You jump from one thought to another, one task to another, without ever fully engaging with any of them. That's why people feel mentally exhausted after a day of noise. It's not the work that drains them. It's the attention switching. Silence allows acetylcholine to do what it was designed to do. Lock your focus onto meaningful goals. When you're not spending your attention on external noise, you gain the ability to channel like a laser. That's when progress accelerates. That's when you start moving with precision instead of pressure. Another system that silence impacts is the default mode network, or DMN. This is the part of the brain that activates when you're not focused on the external world, when you're daydreaming, reflecting, or imagining. The DMN is essential for creativity, long-term planning, and self-awareness, but it only activates in stillness. If you're constantly talking, reacting, consuming, you suppress the DMN. You cut yourself off from the deep insights that only emerge in quiet. Think about it. Your best ideas don't come in meetings or arguments. They come in the shower, during a walk, when you're alone and quiet. That's the brain using silence to connect the dots. It's not downtime. It's creategic time. It's the time when you stop responding to the world and start designing your place in it. There's also a profound relationship between silence and identity. Most people speak to confirm their existence. They talk to be seen, to be validated, to shape how others perceive them. But in doing so, they externalize their identity. They become dependent on feedback to know who they are. That's fragile. That's dangerous. Because when feedback changes, as it always does, so does their self-concept. But when you choose silence, you force your identity inward. You stop outsourcing your sense of self. You begin to define who you are through your actions, not your announcements. Through your discipline, not your declarations. And that kind of identity is neurologically stable. It's built not on the shifting sands of social validation, but on the solid ground of internal alignment. That's what makes you powerful. Not that you're loud, but that you're certain. In a world that rewards noise, silence becomes a superpower. It sharpens your perception. It amplifies your intuition. It allows you to see patterns others miss, to think clearly when others are overwhelmed. It makes you unpredictable, not because you're trying to be mysterious, but because you're not leaking energy. You're not signaling every move. You're not broadcasting your next step. And that makes you harder to manipulate, harder to distract, harder to defeat. Because the person who doesn't need to react is the person who's already won the inner war. Silence also strengthens willpower. Every time you resist the urge to speak unnecessarily, you're training your brain to delay gratification. You're activating the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that governs self-control. And like any muscle, the more you use it, the stronger it becomes. Over time, this builds discipline that extends into every area of life. You eat better. You train hard, work longer. Not because you force yourself, but because your brain has been rewired for restraint, for endurance, for vision over impulse. This is the biological wisdom of silence. It's not about being quiet for the sake of it. It's about creating a neurological environment that supports your highest performance. An environment where your energy is conserved, your focus protected, your identity is stable, and your progress is internally driven. It's a state of alignment that can't be faked, and it can't be disrupted, not by criticism, not by distraction, not by noise, because you're not feeding off the world anymore. You're feeding from within. The greatest transformations do not happen in the spotlight. They happen in the dark, in the quiet, in the invisible hours when no one's watching. That's where energy builds. That's where focus sharpens. That's where identity solidifies. And the neural circuitry is one who emerges from that silence is not just smarter or stronger, but neurologically unstoppable. Withholding your reaction is one of the most neurologically demanding and transformational choices you can make. It doesn't mean you're weak or disengaged. It means you are rewiring your brain to prioritize long control over short-term emotion. Every time you feel the impulse to react, to defend, to attack, to explain, and you choose not to, you are building something powerful inside your nervous system, mental resilience. The brain, especially the prefrontal cortex, adapts based on what you do repeatedly. Reactivity trains the brain to be impulsive. Restraint trains the brain to regulate. Over time, that distinction becomes the difference between someone who is emotionally hijacked by every stimulus and someone who is centered, grounded, and in command of their internal state. This isn't just about behavior. It's the circuitry that governs self-control, clarity, and focus is strengthened not through talking about calmness, but by practicing restraint under pressure. When you withhold your reaction, you interrupt the brain's default stress pattern. Most people operate in a loop of stimulus, reaction, regret. Someone offends them, they react, then they replay it in their mind for hours or days. That loop is biologically costly. Every emotional reaction floods the body with cortisol and adrenaline. These hormones are helpful in short bursts. They prepare you to fight or flee. But when you live in a reactive state, they damage your body and drain your brain. Chronic exposure to stress chemicals impairs memory, erodes mood stability, and shrinks areas like the hippocampus. But something extraordinary happens when you pause instead of pounce. The moment you withhold your reaction, you shift activity away from the limbic system, the emotional brain, and redirect it toward the prefrontal cortex, the executive brain. That shift, repeated over time, trains your system to remain calm under pressure. You don't get there by reading about mindfulness. You get there by facing the fire and refusing to flinch. Mental resilience is not about what happens when things are easy. It's about who you become when the heat rises. And that process begins in milliseconds. The moment you feel triggered, the amygdala sends signals throughout your body. Your pulse quickens, your breathing changes, and your thoughts narrow. That's survival mode. But if you insert even a 1-second pause, breath, a physical stillness, you create a neurological fork in the road. One path leads to the usual reaction. The other leads to mastery. That 1-second decision to not react is a biological investment in your future strength. It might feel small, but in that moment, you are altering your neural circuitry. You're increasing the gray matter in the areas associated with regulation and decreasing it in the regions that fuel emotional impulsivity. The body follows the brain, and the brain follows your pattern. Every time you stay still in a moment of intensity, you are literally changing who you are, not just psychologically, but structurally. When you engage with every challenge impulsively, you're not being brave. You're leaking energy. You're scattering your attention. You're feeding your system an unsustainable rhythm of high-stress inputs. That's what leads to burnout. People don't burn out from hard work. They burn out from reactive engagement, mentally rehearsing conflict, defending their ego, anticipating others' opinions, and reacting to them. All of this pulls energy away from the systems responsible for clarity, recovery, and resilience. But when you withhold your reaction, you allow your brain to restore itself. You give your nervous system space to integrate information, to recalibrate, to reset its baseline. Your neural circuitry is changing. That's when true power builds. Not when you're speaking, but when you're silent. Not when you're proving, but when you're present. It's important to understand that restraint isn't suppression. You're not pushing feelings down. You're observing them without becoming them. That's a major distinction in neuroscience. Suppression increases stress markers. Observation activates the insula, the part of the brain responsible for internal awareness. When you observe your anger without acting on it, you engage a totally different network. You create a feedback loop between your body and your prefrontal cortex. That loop sends a signal: I'm aware of this, and I choose how to respond. That signal increases heart rate variability, a key marker of emotional resilience and nervous system flexibility. This is the same pattern elite performers, trauma survivors, and long-term meditators develop over time. They don't eliminate emotion, they regulate it. And regulation isn't about control in the traditional sense. It's about understanding that your reaction is not a requirement. And some option, the most powerful option, is silence. The brain also adapts to patterns of meaning. When you constantly react to negativity, criticism, or disrespect, you're teaching your brain that those things matter, that they are worth your energy. But when you consistently withhold your reaction, you deprive those stimuli of meaning. Over time, they lose their grip on you. What would have triggered you becomes background noise. Your nervous system no longer flares up. Your attention no longer narrows. Your body no longer tenses. That's adaptation. That's evolution. You have literally trained your biology to remain unshaken in the presence of chaos. And that kind of composure is rare in today's world. Not because people can't attain it, but because most never choose to develop it. We live in a time where everyone feels entitled to an immediate opinion, a sharp comeback, a public declaration. But the people who are truly advancing, biologically, mentally, strategically, are the ones who know how to delay, not avoid but to understand, not to suppress but to observe, because with that delay comes insight. With that pause comes power. With that stillness comes a level of resilience that can't be shaken by circumstance or opinion. It's not about avoiding discomfort. It's about learning how to hold it without letting it control you. The interior cingulate cortex plays a critical role in this process. It helps you monitor conflict, detect errors, and adjust your behavior accordingly. When you react impulsively, this part of the brain doesn't have time to do its job. But when you pause, when you delay the reaction, you engage this system. You give it space to assess, to adapt, to improve. That's the foundation of mental resilience, real-time neurobiological adjustment. Over time, this reshapes your default mode. You no longer move through life on edge, waiting to defend yourself. You move with calm, because your system knows it can handle whatever arises. And that confidence isn't bravado. It's chemistry. It's your biology telling you you've trained for this. You've built the capacity to hold the moment, to endure discomfort, to respond when needed, but only when it truly serves your long-term path. Another crucial element is self-directed attention. When you react, you surrender your attention to the external world. You give power to whoever or whatever triggered you. But when you withhold that reaction, you pull your attention inward. You bring it back under your control. That's where mastery begins. Because attention is the gatekeeper of the brain. What you focus on, you become. If your attention is constantly hijacked by others' behavior, you're building a brain designed to react. But if your attention is anchored in purpose, in observation, in restraint, then you're building a brain that leads, a brain that executes, a brain that endures. This is how high-level performers, thinkers, and creators operate. They don't just have better habits. They have stronger neural patterns. They've trained themselves, over thousands of small moments, to resist the easy reaction and choose the powerful response. That training is invisible to the outside world. No one sees the moment you hold your tongue, steady your breath, or walk away from the argument. But those moments compound. They build a nervous system that isn't thrown off course by every external storm. And over time, that system becomes your competitive advantage. Not because you're louder, but because you're stronger. Withholding your reaction is not just about preserving peace. It's about transforming your relationship with discomfort. It's about teaching your brain that you don't need to escape hard feelings. You can sit with them. You can use them. You can learn from them. And when you do, those feelings lose their power over you. They become signals, not shackles. Tools, not threats. What resilience is, not the absence of stress, but the ability to meet it with strength, with structure, and with strategy. Every time you want to react and don't, you are telling your braining, I am in charge. I choose what matters. I choose where my energy goes. I choose who I become. And that choice, made again and again, is how mental resilience is forged, not in theory, but in the biology of your being.